Hi, I'm Dr. Cheryl Chase. Welcome to Chasing a Child's Potential. Today, I'll be talking about anxiety in the classroom. Anxiety is normal. We all experience some level of anxiety at some point in our lives. It's that kind of worry, kind of nervousness. Maybe you're a little bit fidgety or you have some extra energy. Anxiety in children can present in a very similar way. But anxiety in children seems to have a little bit of a different impact, especially when we're talking about how it affects kids in the classroom. I'd like to take a moment now to talk a little bit about the anxiety response so that you can understand what's happening in the brain and body of a child who's experiencing anxiety at any given moment. Now, human beings are animals, and as animals, we have built within us certain survival instincts, certain ways that we do things, and certain things that happen within us to help us survive and face threats when they occur. One of the best examples I've ever heard is to think of the brain as a peach. And you've got the pit of the peach, or the lower brain centers, and then you've got the fleshy soft part that sits on top of those lower brain centers. The lower brain centers are necessary, and the higher brain centers are necessary, but for very different reasons. These lower brain centers are really geared towards survival. So they mediate or they control things like digestion, your pupils dilating, your heart rate, your blood pressure, and other various aspects of human functioning that are basic life functions. On top of that, we have this fleshy tissue, and that tissue is more responsible for things like memory, problem solving, organization, planning. When we feel threatened, when we feel as though something is happening that is going to be a threat to our well-being, our body goes into a very predictable series of events. And we often think of that as what they call fight or flight. And so our brains have a very predictable and very understandable process that they go through. The lower brain centers hijack the fuel of the brain, so the higher brain centers don't get the fuel that they might have gotten otherwise. In other words, in a threat, the lower brain centers take precedence over the higher order thinking, reasoning, planning, organization, language, judgment. When a child is stressed, those lower brain centers are mobilized and they're very active. The higher brain areas are not as active right now because the child is in survival mode. The child is in fight or flight. That stress response I just described is adaptive and very important when a person is experiencing a physical threat. However, nowadays, most of the threats that we feel that we're experiencing are of the psychological or emotional nature. Our physical well-being is not threatened, but yet our emotional and our psychological well-being is feeling threatened. Our brain does not distinguish between a threat that's legitimately life-threatening and a threat that, for all intents and purposes, isn't life-threatening. In other words, our brain responds the same way whether we're being chased by a tiger or someone said something horribly mean on the playground and we're hurting. The stresses still create the same series of events in the brain, and the brain then is geared towards survival of that event. That stress response was never designed to be implemented and used and called upon daily. It's a very exhausting response for a body to go through. And for a child to be stressed on a near chronic level can have a significant impact over time. Their body is filled with stress hormones, and their brain is not coming to school prepared to engage those higher brain centers for thinking, reasoning, and language. What some people call brain ready. The child who's anxious comes to your classroom and is not brain ready to learn. How might an anxious child look in the classroom? There are certain signs and symptoms that we can keep an eye out for to tell whether a child is suffering from anxiety or not while in our classroom. A child who is anxious may be nervous or may be worried, but anxiety doesn't always look like a scared, nervous child. Anxiety may present as difficulty focusing and paying attention, problems with attendance, disruptive behavior, or frequent visits to the nurse. The first thing you might want to be looking for is difficulty focusing and paying attention in the classroom. So a child with anxiety is often concentrating on something else and not following along with the class for a larger lecture period or while reading at their desk. That student may appear inattentive or disinterested when in fact the student is really dealing with anxiety. Another set of symptoms that we may see is difficulty with attendance. The student may be coming to school late, or the student may not be coming to school at all from time to time. And those can be motivated by either an avoidance of going to school or not wanting to go to school for some reason driven by anxiety, or not wanting to leave home. There may be things at home that if the child leaves, he or she becomes anxious. In other words, wanting to still be where mom is or wanting to still be where grandma is. Another set of symptoms that may well be indicative of anxiety are disruptive behaviors. So a child may be acting out or doing things that we might consider bad behavior because in fact the child is anxious. And that bad behavior may well be allowing the child to avoid something that causes anxiety. So in other words, let's say a child is struggling with reading. We may see disruptive behavior acting out before reading class pretty consistently so that the student is reprimanded or sent out of the classroom or somehow gets out of reading. We may also see that at home with homework. If homework is difficult, for example, math might be a difficult area for the child. The child may engage in all sort of what we call escape behaviors, behaviors that get the child out of having to do the math homework. It may be complaining of a stomach ache or a headache. It may be needing to sharpen a pencil. It may be refusing to sit at the table and get the work done. Or in older children, it may be forgetting the math homework, forgetting the math textbook. Many of these behaviors are in fact red flags of an underlying anxiety condition. Another symptom or sign that a child may be suffering from anxiety is frequent trips to the nurse. The student may be uncomfortable with a situation, and that's showing itself up in some body ache or discomfort. So in other words, stomach aches, headaches, frequent complaints about their health or their well-being. Anxiety in the classroom is an extremely important thing to be able to detect and to address so that your students can learn and perform at their best. The biggest key is understanding, recognizing and realizing that the behaviors that you're seeing are in fact due to underlying anxiety and not really due to lack of motivation, disruptive, oppositional behaviors, that the student is in fact experiencing anxiety. Thank you for joining me today. I'm sure you'll find this information helpful as you're out there chasing a child's potential.